Welcome back to Cove Street Boatworks. Today we have a 14-foot Alcort Sunfish in for restoration. These are really cool boats. They're, like I said, they're 14 foot. They're about 120 pounds, so they're not as light as they may look. They were great and are great trainers if you have kids that you want to get out and learn how to sail and learn how not to panic when the boat flips, because you'll spend as much time in the water as on the boat with these things. But it's a really good trainer to get kids more confident in, capsizing a boat and getting it turned over and getting it righted and underway again. It's a pretty easy thing to do, and it's a great teacher for that. The original design, the Sailfish, which I have an early Sailfish, was just a board boat. That was in 1943. It was in response to the American Red Cross looking for a rescue board boat. And it was designed with a sail, and it was very, very popular. This came out about 1952 or 1953. It had a cockpit. It is a sealed cockpit, so even if you capsize these, the hull itself doesn't fill with water, so it's buoyant, and you can right it pretty easily. And again, an excellent trainer. The top deck is started to delaminate. This was a kit boat. It's all wood. It was built originally by the family that still owns it, by the son and the father of that family. And it is used every year. So it came in here originally for a new deck. We thought that the delamination was probably pretty extensive. 50s plywood, the glue that they used in it wasn't always the greatest and didn't last as long as it should have. But when it got to the shop and I took a look at it and started sounding it, I could see that really it was just checked in very, very localized areas. It was not broad spread. There wasn't a lot of delamination in that top layer. So we decided, rather than pull the deck off, because these decks are ring nailed and screwed and glued in place, so getting them off isn't always very pretty, we're going to leave it because the majority of the plywood, the veneers are tight and intact. We're going to strip this down to bare wood. We're going to try to sand where those open checks have opened up a little bit so that we can more easily get penetrating epoxy into those cracks, and then maybe force some quick bear or some kind of thickened epoxy into them to get them to seal up. And then we'll resand this and primer it and repaint the whole boat. So that's the plan. We're going to take off the plastic rub rails. We're going to leave the combing and the mast step in place. We'll mask that off. We'll mask off the metal trim around the cockpit. There's some checking in the cockpit as well around the keelson. We'll take a look at that, and we'll fix that. And this will be a really good opportunity for us to look at not just being stuck in an epoxy mindset, but in along the keel where it's checked, right at that interface where the keel lies on top of the plywood. It's probably going to be easier to clean that out and to use something like 3M 5200 in there, because it has really good adhesive quality, it seals really well, and it's not likely to pull apart and check again. All right, so as we finish using the heat gun and scraping off this paint, naturally your scrapers are going to get dull. And this is a Pro Prep scraper. I love these scrapers. We talked about these way back in one of the first episodes. They aren't made anymore. Stainless steel blades, really easy to sharpen. Take just a mill file, and you're putting it flat against the back. And I know I'm obscuring your view here a little bit, but flat against the back to take off any burr. And we're just going to flatten that back out. And this is going to be really not a very sophisticated sharpening method, but it's because we're going to be chewing through some materials here, stripping these paints and primers, and it's really harsh on the blades. So it doesn't make any sense to spend a lot of time sharpening these. They aren't going to last. So we're going to put about less than a 45-degree angle on this, and we're just going to literally just pull across the face of this. Try to keep it flat. If you do this more often, try to keep it in the picture here. If you do this more often, get it a little bit dull and then take a few passes with this, it'll come right back to a sharp edge. It is a wire edge. I mean, it's not something that's built for long last, but you can run your finger across it and it should pull on your skin a bit. If it doesn't, all you're going to do is get dusting with this. When we use the heat gun, we're heating it up until we start to see bubbling, and then we're going to put the scraper down and we're going to draw away that loosened material. We are not going to do this. People who scrub with edge tools, whether it's a chisel or a hand plane or a scraper, they're dulling it out with that push stroke. Never do that. When you see experienced people use a hand plane, they do a push, and then if you see them draw back on the piece of wood, they're lifting the blade so there's no contact, just the toe of the plane. And even that wears the plane a little bit. You really should push, lift, bring it back, set it down, push, lift, bring it back. Same thing with a scraper. Blow everything out of the way here. I'd be a little more careful if this was lead. I would be vacuuming it up and keeping it from spreading all over the shop. It's not. I know it's not because I put it on. So we can be pretty confident about that. So the heat gun's just, this is an older heat gun. It takes a little while to heat up, but it's coming up now. I can see it start to bubble a little bit. We want to try to avoid as much smoke as possible. You'll always get a little bit, but... And another thing you want to do is not put the tool in the heat gun. I have melted these. There's little metal inserts that hold the screws in place in these composite handles. And I've gotten them hot enough so that the inserts pulled out of the plastic body. So you want to make sure that you're heating the film that you're trying to remove. And then once that starts to break away and you start to see the bubbles, take the heat source away. And some people get really good at this. They can keep the heat source ahead of the scraper, but just make sure that the scraper doesn't end up spending a prolonged period of time in that heat, because it will damage them. This does a pretty good job getting that surface really clean. And you know, it's going to take probably a couple hours to strip the top of this by hand. If I were to use a sander, I could probably do it faster, but I'd be making a huge mess. I'd be getting dust all over the shop, and I'd be putting waves in the plywood. This method doesn't really put, if you're careful and you're just scraping the film off, it doesn't really deform the surface of the plywood at all. You can see I'm taking a tiny bit of wood off, but very, very, very small. The more of the finish I can get off, the less likely when I sand that I'm going to fill the sandpaper in. So it's that balance. You want to make sure that you get enough of the finish off so that you can efficiently and effectively sand, but you don't want to worry about getting every little piece of film, you know, paint or whatever primer off. It's not necessary, especially after you hit it with the heat gun. The film tends to get more brittle, the paint or the primer, so it sands easier. And you can see I'm starting to expose the puttied ring nail holes, which is how they nailed these together. The material appears to be either a Luan or a Philippine mahogany plywood, which, as you all know, Philippine mahogany is not mahogany at all, but it's in the cedar family. Whenever you're taking anything off the boat, like this piece of rubber rail, make sure that you have a container to put all the fasteners in so that they're all collected. Try to keep them separate, especially if they're different lengths, and always label them. So this one we're going to label port side and aft. That way you know that they always go back on the same way. For hardware like this bow handle, the screws, more than likely, they're not going to be the same size. These happen to be, but that's unusual. Over the years, they get replaced. So I always like to make sure that the screws stay in the same place. And the best way to do this is just with a simple piece of masking tape, just to leave the screws in their intended hole and just mask over them. And, you know, that way, you're always sure that the same screw goes in the same hole that holds the hardware in, so you don't have to fill the holes and put new screws in. So we're about 2 hours into stripping this boat. We're a little less than halfway done. No big issues so far. Everything looks good as far as the plywood goes. It's pretty much coming along just as we thought. So we're going to continue here in the front. We're at the cockpit. We've been able to, the metal edge on this cockpit is nice. You overlap the paint onto the metal edge so you seal that gap in between. And because it's aluminum and it's protecting the edge, it comes off really, really easily. So that's nice. It gives us a little bit of a edge to guide the scraper against. Some people ask me, which way should you scrape when you're heat stripping like this? Should you scrape across the grain or with the grain? And of course, the famous answer is, it depends. Sometimes it's more aggressive if you go across the grain, but sometimes that won't strip it as cleanly. It'll leave some residue. So it really depends on how sharp your scraper is, what the materials you're taking off, how well your heat gun is distributing heat and how hot it gets. And it depends on the quality of the wood that's underneath it. So I would suggest, you know, you try both, or what I'm doing right now is a 45-degree angle. It's not really totally across the grain, and it's not with the grain, it's in between. And you can see I'm going to switch here to being with the grain. And you can see it does come off cleaner. And that's usually what you'll experience. But you can't always go with the grain. Sometimes you're stuck going across it. And again, there's no problem with that. If the scraper is sharp, it shouldn't really matter which way you go. It's one of the beauties of scrapers, is that you can go across the grain, with the grain, across burls, you know, rough grain that you can't really take any other edge tool to. Scrapers, classically, if they're really sharp, they're effective on any kind of grain. This is sort of Zen work. It's somewhat tedious. Watching it has got to be like watching a YouTube unboxing. Probably just about as useful. I have no idea why people like watching unboxings. I just look at them and I'm just amazed that people would even spend the time doing it. And similarly, people are probably saying, oh my God, watching a guy heat strip paint. That is incredibly boring. And you know what? You're probably right. You can go back over places where you have a little bit of a heavy deposit, and you can lift those pretty easily. Of course, you can sand it too. It depends on how the nature of the material you're removing, whether it's really gummy or not. If it's gummy, it's going to follow the sandpaper. Sandpaper is expensive, so this is a more economical way to remove it. And we'll definitely start this at like 80 grit. 80 grit's pretty much the standard for any grit you want to use, where you're trying to clean up material and you're trying to prepare the surface for bonding for primer and paint. You can go down to 100, even 120, but the finer you get with the grit, the less mechanical keying you're going to get. And since paint and primer are mechanically keyed to the surface of the wood and not chemically bound, then you need to leave a certain amount of grit, of scratches in the surface for the paint to adhere to. So when we were going to redeck this boat, I was wondering if the plywood, because it's a little less than 14 feet long, you don't want to order plywood special that's that length because it's difficult to ship and it's expensive. I was wondering if they used a butt block to join two regular 8-foot sheets of 1/4-inch plywood together, or they scarfed it. And we can see here, here's the scarf line right in the middle of the centerboard slot, the dagger board, and there's no fasteners. So this is scarfed. So measuring from this scarf joint to the transom is 7 foot 2 inches. And measuring from the scarf joint to the bow is 6 foot 6 inches. If we used a 12-to-1 ratio scarf and it was 1/4-inch plywood, that means that 12 times that 1/4-inch would be the length of the scarf that we would manufacture to glue. So it would be about 3 inches. So this 7 foot 2 would extend 3 inches. That would bring it up to 7 foot 5, thereabouts, 7 foot 6. So I guess that's credible. All right, about 2/3 of the boat are done in about 3.5, almost 4 hours. it is time consuming, especially when you're working around details of the varnished work and everything. It's taken a while, but you can see the results are really clean. The checks are now wide open and revealed, and it should be pretty easy tomorrow to hit this with a longboard with an air sander and cut off the rest of the finish, get it flattened out, open up those checks a little bit, and epoxy seal it tomorrow. So we got to just do the rest of the front, and we should be good to go, I think. So there you go. We got about, after removing the hardware and everything, we got at least 6 hours into this so far total. What seems like such a simple task, they really add up. It's very time consuming. All right, thank you very much. We'll catch up with this in the next episode.